I'm Harpinder Collicott, also known as PIN, and I'm the Executive Director of Global Public Investment Network, and I'll also be your moderator for this event today. So first thing with regards to housekeeping, just to let you know, we're recording this event today, and we will make sure that the recording is made available to everybody. So those of you who do have to leave early, there will be a recording to be able to access. So I hope that is okay with everybody. We also have a chat function, a Q&A function. So please do, if you have questions throughout the meeting, put your questions and comments in there. We will do our best to make sure we have time for a facilitated discussion towards the end after the presentation, and we will try to bring you in, so be prepared to be brought in on the conversation as well. So with that, I'm going to first of all tell you a little bit about global public investment. Sorry, but I keep getting pop-ups coming up about recordings, etc. So as we're gathering here today, I want to just reflect a little bit about where we are on the journey with global public investment and the network itself. And I'm really excited to say that this year we're going to be launching a bold, coordinated campaign to elevate global public investment as a vital solution with regards to the pressing interconnected challenges that we're all facing today. And the aim of this campaign is basically to define a vision for international cooperation for the future. So this campaign is not just going to be about visibility, it's going to be about shifting that paradigm. So over the coming year, we'll be focusing on building recognition, but legitimacy also for global public investment as a concept. And we'll be specifically focusing on governments. And the goal is going to be to secure at least 20 country governments by the end of 2025, with 10 actively supporting the idea of global public investment as the cornerstone for tackling global public challenges which no nation can tackle alone. We want to see global public investment become central to how we organise and finance international cooperation. And we're very committed, as you know, to the principles of shared contributions, shared benefits, and shared decision-making. We've been very much inspired by the growing momentum from Global South and Global North alike that is calling for more representative, equitable systems which take on the most pressing global challenges. And that's where the root of this campaign is coming from. So we believe that global public investment offers that clear pathway forward, one that's not based on outdated notions of charity or dependence or on a relationship of North and South, but one on mutual cooperation, mutual responsibility, and collective self-interest. Hopefully you'll be hearing a little bit more about that today in the paper that we're launching today. But what I wanted to just let you know on the outset that we'll also be launching this campaign later on in May. So coming to you very soon will be more information on how we will be launching this campaign. And we're very keen to ensure that at the heart of the campaign is country engagement, narrative building, media and advocacy, and efforts to secure high-level political and civil society commitments. So your support is going to be critical for us to be able to move this campaign forward. And I'm looking forward to working with you to look at how we can amplify the campaign across your networks, how we can engage governments and representatives and decision makers, but also how you can use your platforms, social media, events, other conversations you're having to take this vision of global public investment forward. So it's going to be a year of collaboration, deep collaboration with you all. And I'm really looking forward to working with you to push this vision of global public investment forward as that backbone of international solidarity, mutual benefit, and inclusive cooperation. And today's event is very much about kicking that year off for us. I know we're in April, end of April, but it is a good opportunity today to be able to kick off this event as GPI and the launch of a new paper which has been linked in the chat and has been authored by our very own Jonathan Glennie. You all know Jonathan, who's very well known within this community. He's one of the founding members of the network. He's also on our steering committee, and he's the director of the organisation called Global Cooperation Institute. Jonathan's published this report recently, The Birth of Global Public Investment, and today he's going to take us through some of the key elements of the paper. We've also got 4 discussants who will be reflecting on some of the contents of the paper, but also giving us a little bit more on their thoughts and reflections of actually where does global public investment fit into the wider external environment that we're in at the moment, and the complexity of it, and how we navigate that environment to go forward. So their remarks will be really important to help inform our strategy, but also think through how do we take global public investment forward into the future. I will introduce each of our eminent panelists as I come to them for the discussant. But before then, I want to hand over to Jonathan, who's going to take us through the findings of the report first and set us up for our discussion this morning. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pin. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Particularly grateful to the speakers that have joined us, Jayati and Mariana, are really 2 of the great intellectual pioneers behind public finance in this moment, what Mariana calls public purpose, the public sector, and in South Africa and Norway, and particularly with Josephilda on board Vegar when he joins, 2 countries and 2 leaders that have led again and again on this issue. Really grateful that they're here, and grateful to Harpender and the DPI network for organising this, and really to all the people that have been part of. And something that we're very proud of is that we tried to co-create this idea over a number of years, and many people have been involved in building this over time. And it's exciting that we've got to this stage, even though the world is in this crazy place. Actually, it's an opportunity to make some progress, and that's where I want to start. We're told that everything has changed, but I'd like to just dwell briefly on 2 things that haven't changed. First, the fundamental trends in geopolitics and geoeconomics, the rise of the global south over the last decades, including but not limited to China. And some of it's so obvious that we forget, and we're caught up in this very, very big historical moment. But the gradual end of empire, be that the European empire, and frankly, the Trump moment is a reflection of the gradual end of the US empire that dominated the 20th century. These are the big trends. Secondly, the end of a simplistic neoliberal narrative. All of my professional life, I've been waiting for this moment where certainly in academia, the neoliberal narrative is no longer dominant. And to some extent in actual policy, we've seen that with policies in the US itself and elsewhere over the last couple of years. So, there's a space and an opening for the public in a way that hasn't really existed for decades. And then thirdly, and again, this is so obvious that we sometimes, overlook it, the growing sense of one world. And we're obsessed with nationalism at the moment and how we seem to be reverting to national type. But it is inevitable and gradual that we become more of one village as this century progresses. So the fundamental trends, despite the comms that you hear again and again, have not changed. And the second thing that hasn't changed are the fundamental needs of this evolving world. Climate needs, the new needs and challenges of digital, conflict, whether that is violent or otherwise, the health needs of our planet, the educational needs of our planet. So the other thing that hasn't changed is that we need a large amount of money for all of this in a changing world. And that brings me to global public investment and the need to remake international finance for the 21st century. And the way that I've constructed this report is really just trying to follow quite a simple logic and seeing if people come with it. So first, I think we have to accept that we do need substantial money for global challenges. And I cite the work of Stern, Songway, and Bhattacharya, because they're very well respected, but you can find countless reports that set out how much money is required to respond to these major global challenges. And I'm taking that as an assumption. I mean, there are maybe people around the world that don't agree with that assumption. I'm assuming that most people on this call do. We need tons of money to meet the challenges we face. And then we need to agree, the second step is that it can't be led by the private sector, whether for profit, and here I want to share with you a new word that I made up while jogging in Washington a couple of days ago, or the philanthropic sector. And philanthropic is, the newness of that word is that I'm spelling it F-I-L-L philanthropic. And the definition is philanthropic resources that are now being put forward to fill the gap left behind by the retreat of public resources. And I'm here in New York at this Financing for Development conference, and I'm afraid that there is a lot of talk as if it's the end of public money at the international level, the end of substantial, significant public money at the international level. And people are calling for private money, whether that be for-profit or philanthropic private money, to fill that gap. So my assumption, and it's somewhat set out in this report, but it's written in myriad others, pieces that I've written with Jayati, Mariana herself has written all about this, of course, and many others. We can't just rely on private and philanthropic money or leadership to resolve challenges, whether at the national, regional, or international level. We need public institutions and powerful ones, and that means substantial public money. So let's agree that we need some form of global public investment, and whether that's hard right now in 2025 because of all sorts of political and economic constraints, it's still required to be built over the next 5, 10, 15 years. The question is how big that pot needs to be and how it will be structured. So the quantity and the characteristics of global public investment. And in this report, I focus down on 2 aspects that we need to work on. There are many ways that one could cut this, but the way that I do it here is that first the rationale, the narrative, and then second the institutions, the system and the structure. So just taking those 2 in turn. We need a narrative renaissance, and it needs to focus on mutual interest. If global public investment is to succeed, we need to actually revive and update an old story of international cooperation. And some of the work I've been doing recently is looking at the birth of the Bretton Woods institutions, controversial find in the way that they have acted over the last 80 years, but they were born out of a very clear narrative. And you can see it in all the speeches that are made around that time, that there is no significant tension between the national interests of those countries that are building the Bretton Woods institutions and the global interests. They are seen as one. It's clear that significant public investment in global rebuilding, reconstruction, as they called it in development, is in the national interest of those countries building the Bretton Woods institutions. And that is in direct contrast, I'm afraid, with the way that politicians talk about internationalism and public investment internationally today, where they conceive it as and propose it as charitable and compassionate, but not directly in the national interest. And we have to shift that if we're going to rebuild and build global public investment. It's a simple starting point, one that we all accept, but that we haven't communicated successfully to our politicians and our publics. In a connected world, our destinies are linked. Investments in health, clean energy, stable economy, peace, anywhere, strength and security and well-being everywhere. And we need to embody that principle as we build global public investment. And this means a communications ecosystem that resonates with citizens and leaders throughout the world. We have to be hard-nosed about that. It's not a question of whether we frame this as if it's in the national interest. That's a given. We have to do that. The question is how we frame the national interest, and we need to talk about mutual interests and building globally together rather than competitive transactional interests, which are somewhat dominant at the moment. And then the second thing I talk about is the institutional evolution, so embedding mutuality. And while global public investment envisions new structures, there's no need to wait for one single global breakthrough. We can make progress by embedding global public investment principles about all contribute, all decide, and all benefit within existing institutions and initiatives, as well as building new ones. And at the core is this principle of mutuality, building systems where responsibilities are shared, governance is inclusive, and benefits are collectively owned. And I think there are huge opportunities to apply those principles already in climate finance mechanisms, in pandemic response platforms, global tax initiatives, of course, which Jayati is a leader in, regional development banks, all offer these entry points to strengthen shared governance, which has often been a part of the international institutions that we've already got. But now, as we enter kind of the second quarter of the 21st century, we need to take that one step further. And one of the consequences of the geopolitical turmoil that we're living in right now is that there are indeed opportunities to build new institutions, even if it's hard. There is, I think, quite a a strong momentum, especially from the global south. And it is noticeable, I've got to say this, in meetings where you're in the global north, in Washington, in London, in Europe, there is a sense of doom and gloom, and I totally get that. And I'm not being glib. There are really big challenges, especially nationally in the US and elsewhere. But when you have meetings with colleagues in the global south, in Latin America, I live in Colombia, in Africa and Asia, there is linked to the sense of risk and concern a great sense of opportunity to remake systems and narratives for a different time. And I think we need to ride on that. And I think there's a real possibility of doing that. But what we need is leadership. There is a sense sometimes in some of these meetings of a defeatism, that this is kind of the end of something. And that's why we call this report the birth of global public investment, because it's very much the beginning of something. We believe that this is the time that we can really build something exciting and new that is effective, because there's no point in getting the theory right, but without the detailed administrative requirements that make public spending internationally effective and impactful. So just to finish, I want to make sure all our speakers get a really good amount of time. As we rightly adopt defensive positions in the short term, we need to think medium and long term about how we build something better on top of the rubble of the old ways. And luckily, as we do that, we're not constrained by the limits of the current US or any other administration any more than Keynes and others were constrained as they envisioned the Bretton Woods institutions decades ago. I mean, they were thinking through the new order in the middle of war, and they were planning for the peace. And I think that's where we find ourselves now. We need to plan and build for the moment when we can establish something really exciting that will be effective for the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you so much for being so succinct so we can have a little bit more time for our discussants. So let me, with that, move forward to introduce Mariana Mazzucato, who I'm sure doesn't need an introduction, but I will introduce her as the Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value at the University College London in the UK. She's also the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So in Mariana's two different titles there, public value and public purpose feature strongly, as it did in Jonathan's remarks. The importance of public finance is really critical, but yet we're not hearing much about that. We're hearing a lot about the fact that public finance may be limited for the future. And obviously, this is being largely led by changes we're seeing in the US, but also in the European landscape at the moment, particularly for overseas assistance, foreign assistance, and overseas development cooperation. So this is informing a lot of the discourse that we're hearing with regards to the demise of public finance and the need for more private finance. Mariana, I wanted to ask you, first of all, if you could potentially set out for us why public finance is so important and how do we continue to position it at this crucial time as the key policy instrument at the global level, which is going to be so essential for global challenges to be addressed. And I'm keen to hear a little bit more from you on how do you put public sector at the heart of these discussions as well, so that we are hearing from those who are actually able to lead with the public purse as well. So Mariana, can I bring you in here as our first discussant?
Sure. And I hope you can hear me. I don't know if it was your system or mine, but it's quite choppy, so forgive me if it's me. So great question, and also real big congratulations to Jonathan and the team. This report's coming out at an incredibly important time. We have these three big events happening. We have the G20, we have COP, we have the Seville meeting on rethinking, basically finance, the Finance for Development Forum, where we should all be very, very clear where the problems are. I don't think anyone, even Trump, no one is saying we don't need the public. It's what do we mean by the public? And, my work has been very much about that. I think even the concept of public goods is problematic. it's still framed in terms of correcting for a market failure. And if you're filling the gap, literally, filling a financial gap, so 7 trillion in a financial gap, apparently for the SDGs, then we're already in the wrong mindset. It's like there's a hole, we got to throw money in it, as opposed to what? Shaping the economy, shaping finance, really paying a lot of attention on the quality. And precisely because we don't think enough about public purpose and public value, then actually the public bit often is part of the problem. Just look at public banks. Yes, of course they're needed. They provide that patient, long-term, committed finance that impatient finance doesn't provide. But if they're just giving out money to whatever sector is yelling for help, as many public banks do, including in Italy, where I'm from, then they become part of the problem. Very different if that bank is driven by public purpose. It's not a coincidence. I, as you said, called the institute that I set up at UCL, which, by the way, is a department. So we really believe that the training in the economics profession needs to change if we believe in this. Public purpose and public value need to be design principles for that public finance. And this issue, by the way, that Jonathan picks up on of mutualism is something that's critical. I've recently been writing about how mutualism, reciprocity, my God, I used to say that, now Trump's used it for the tariffs. Anyway, symbiosis is how we design contracts. Even intellectual property rights, for example, they're not rights from God. They are rights that the state gives the private sector. And if we don't actually design those contracts with mutualism, you end up getting really problematic patents. So it's not that patents in and of themselves are bad. It's that if we don't govern them with public purpose, and just with patents, if you think about it, the reason we have them since the Middle Ages basically was actually not only to privatize the knowledge, but actually to codify it. Instead of having secrecy, as we had in the Middle Ages, you had to write down, right, the innovation. So once the patent is up, that patent actually helps to diffuse knowledge as opposed to keeping things secret. What have we done? We've misgoverned them. They're too wide, they're too strong, they're too upstream. So this whole issue of governing around purpose really matters. And in my recent writing, which I think is really connected, I think, to, oops, can you hear me? To this report is I think we need to be much more ambitious about the public good and actually use words like the common good, because the common good is an objective that we're trying to reach, where then the how matters as much as the what. It's not just a public good fixing something that the private sector hasn't done. So if you look at all the public good literature, including global public goods, but even the commons literature, which fixes for a different problem, government failure, not just market failure, then we're again always in corrective mode. And it's hard to then really start with what the goal is and then backtrack and design all the different relationships, including especially those public-private relationships that are part of the problem. And I think, Keynes has been massively misunderstood. It's not just about countercyclical lending and countercyclical fiscal policy. He had a great quote where he said, the point of government is not to do things a little bit worse or a little bit better, but to really be doing what's not being done at all. And if we think of the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not being done at all. But the problem is they weren't then translated into kind of concrete missions that require lots of different sectors to work together and different parts of government to work together to solve them. That's why I talk about mission-oriented policies, trying to translate these challenges into concrete missions that industrial strategies then focus on. So instead of having a sectoral policy, we then have challenges that require these different sectors to transform and innovate. And again, that comes back to the public investment, because without leading public investment, history tells us we don't get the private investment. It doesn't get crowded in. But if it does get crowded in, that's not the objective, to crowd into the private sector. It's to solve a problem. And if we don't have good contracts and these principles of mutualism, we just get the private sector into different areas and we say, oh, tick the box. We now have some private sector investment. But it again becomes part of the problem. And I go back to the public bank example. There's really some good examples, like in Brazil and in Germany, where those public banks did put conditionality. We can use different words, conditionality, reciprocity, mutualism, but to be honest, it was in the contract that, for example, in Germany, the loan to the steel sector was conditional that that sector innovate and become greener and lower the material content of production. It was in the public contract for a public bank. So we need to go beyond just talking about the MDBs and the national banks and public investment to really unpick the contractual obligations, these issues of mutualism that Jonathan talks about. Again, I've talked about it for a long time in terms of symbiotic ecosystems versus parasitic ecosystems. Biologists have always talked about that. Economists don't. We just use the word ecosystem in a neutral way, but really making sure we even have metrics, dashboards that tell us, are we building a parasitic predator-prey ecosystem, or is it truly symbiotic? And just lastly, in some recent papers, one I did for UNDESA, where I critiqued blended finance, we need to be careful about these narratives, as you rightly began, because blended sounds good, but if ultimately we have low volume, low mobilization, geographical inequity, and very low impact, 70% of blended climate finance goes to international corporations, not local firms or SMEs, very low volume. There's only about 15 billion in blended finance, nowhere near the trillions, and only 39% of blended finance actually comes from the private sector. So they're basically just socializing risks and privatizing rewards. Then we need actually to be very clear that public investment, which then works with the private sector in problematic ways, is bad for everyone. And we need to actually, again, put much more attention on these details of how to properly leverage and create multiplier effects that have guided by public purpose, and using the MDBs, for example, to help guide the national banks, which is where most of the money is, over 22 trillion, and have those national banks work with the local private sector in, again, a symbiotic way and not a problematic way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I know we've only got you for a short amount of time. So those of you who are online, if we've got any questions for Mariana, please do put them in the chat. I'll try to review them and come back to Mariana before she leaves in 15 minutes. But before I come in with any questions, Mariana, that was fantastic. And I really like the idea, the concept of common good as opposed to public good. And I think we're all discussing narratives and language at the moment, which language resonates and how do we ensure that this concept of mutuality, where we're looking at our interests from an individual perspective, from a policy perspective, but from politics perspective, how do we ensure that the language is going to gel with the individual, the citizen on the ground, their representative, and make its way up to that policy level discussion as well. And I think I really like those concepts you're bringing in about common goods, symbiotic ecosystem, where we all benefit, not just some, but also not being wasteful, the efficiency and quality of public funding. It's a precious resource. I think we always say this, it's a precious resource. We need to put it where it has the greatest impact. And I really like those concepts that you're bringing in there. So thank you for that. I will look out for questions that will, I'm sure, start streaming in for you. But in the meantime, I'm going to bring in our other discussant, Jayati Ghosh, who again is incredibly well known in this space and a leader and thinker in around public finance as well. So Jayati is the Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and she's also the co-chair of the Independent Commission on Reform of International Cooperation Taxation. There are a couple of issues that are really featuring strongly in the financing for development discussions, and tax is definitely one of them. So Jayati, my question for you is, how does GPI link to the tax work that you're leading on? Why are these two concepts so important? And how do we create that much more fairer, just ecosystem of international financing for the future?
Well, thanks a lot, Harpinder, and it's great to be here in this group. And of course, wonderful to follow Mariana because she's already made all the important points. So there's less for me to talk about. But it's interesting, this concept of mutuality, which is very much in the paper, and I think Mariana also mentioned it, because you cannot get a better example of the need for mutuality than the tax systems. I mean, literally, we have tax systems that are so broken today that everybody loses. Every government in the world loses. Every citizen of every country loses. And of course, there are a few gainers, of course. There are the large multinational corporations and the extremely wealthy who get away with paying much lower taxes than regular domestic companies or ordinary people. So in a way, as long as we persist with this current global framework, every time we mention global public investment, I don't know about you, but every time I mention it to any policymaker anywhere, there's a bit of rolling of eyes and saying, where is the money kind of thing, right? And of course, we know that there is money. We know that there is this enormous stock of wealth available. We know that there are multinational corporations that are simply adding to their reserves because they cannot find appropriate channels to push into for further investment and so on. And we also know that that inability of states to raise the minimum resources that they need is inhibiting their ability to do anything. Forget the global part of the public investment, but essentially providing basic needs for your people, doing the minimum necessary for adjusting to climate change. Mitigation is another issue there's hardly any money for, and so on. So here is a context in which we are allowing an institutional framework to prevent us from accessing resources that are there and that are being unfairly appropriated by a very, very small elite segment of the population. In fact, I would really call these foregone taxes effectively rents. Rents in the sense that they come from the ability to influence state policy. They come from the ability to determine reliance on a very broken global system that allows for the transfer of profits to low tax jurisdictions, that enables the shift of assets to tax havens, and that doesn't do anything about that. So taxation is an absolutely critical part of the whole GPI movement, also because, it really does exemplify the mutuality. To me, I think part of the reason there isn't such a bigger demand for just minimally acceptable forms of taxation, just taxation, is because most people in the world and most citizens of rich countries in particular don't actually realize how much they're losing from this. How much their governments claim, oh, we don't have the money for this, oh, we'll have to have this deficit, that will be inflationary, etc., 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 without pointing out that they are in fact giving away, effectively subsidizing, because that's the opposite of not taxing, effectively subsidizing the richest people in their nations and the largest corporations globally. These are things that can be dealt with very easily. Okay, so there are two very simple ideas, and these are simple ideas that, in fact, the OECD in principle agreed with when it looked at this whole issue of base erosion and profit shifting, as it was called. The first idea is that, look, a multinational company is actually one company. It's not Apple India and Apple France and Apple US and Apple Taiwan and so on. It is Apple. And Apple has one set of shareholders. So we have to tax Apple as one company. And every country says, well, this is our share of Apple's global profits based on, say, sales and employment. And we will tax that share of global profits at the same rate that we tax our domestic companies. Instead of that, what can Apple do? At the moment, Apple can say, oh, no, I can't do that. I mean, I may have so much sales in your country, but actually I don't have any profits in your country because I have to give so much money to this subsidiary in Ireland, in Dublin, because they hold all the intellectual property. I have to give a whole bunch of interest payments to this subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, etc. And by the way, it's not just the Cayman Islands and the usual suspects that are the tax havens. Delaware, the state that Joe Biden comes from, there's a bunch of US states that are big tax havens. The United Kingdom has big tax havens, the Channel Islands and so on. The Netherlands is a tax haven, Ireland is a tax haven, and so on. The ability of multinationals to exploit these means that many of them get away with effective tax rates of less than 2% on their profits globally, which you will agree is ridiculous, right? And it's also obscene because we are losing hundreds of billions of dollars to taxpayers. That's one case in which if you actually did implement this system, taxpayers or citizens of the richer countries would in fact be significantly better off because they are the main. Much of the money would go to them. But of course, proportionately speaking, there would be huge advantages for citizens of developing countries as well. But similarly, the taxation of extreme wealth. I don't have to tell this crowd about how important inequality, how significant inequality has become, and how every time we talk about it, it goes up further, right? And of course, the sheer expanse of the wealth of the top 0.001% is now mind-boggling and beyond obscene, right? And yet they can get away with paying almost no tax, like Jeff Bezos, presumably Elon Musk. I'm not sure about him, but I think pretty much all of them don't pay tax because you can use the rules of investment in ways that actually prevent you from having to pay income taxes. So there's a very strong case for wealth taxes. And in fact, there's been a lot of studies done by Gabriel Zucman and others to show that if you have very, very low rates of tax, say 1.5%, 2%, on the billionaires and the centimillionaires, which is really, you're talking such a small number that it's like a stock market variation. It's really not something that they're even going to notice. And you don't necessarily tax the wealth, but you tax the equivalent of that in any other form. It could be a dividend tax, it could be whatever, but you are taxing the equivalent of 1.5 or 2% of their wealth. That alone brings anything in the range of $250 and above $1 billion per year. In other words, so much in terms of pure financial resources can be released for public investment, and therefore for global public investment, through very, very simple measures that would bring down, not even marginally, frankly, the kind of obscene inequality we see, but would necessarily make available much, much more resources. We could think of higher tax rates eventually, but you could begin with a very, very small rate on the extremely wealthy. Of course, the argument is, then they just move the money around. But now with country by country reporting, it is possible to identify the financial wealth of people because 140 countries are actually listed. They're sharing the information about the financial assets. And you can say, well, as long as you're a tax resident in my country, you're going to have to pay on the money wherever it is held. This is what Colombia did, for example. A bunch of other countries do this. Then they'll say, okay, we're leaving. We're going to avoid your taxes by leaving you. You can have an exit tax, which France has, and a bunch of other countries are considering. There are ways of taxing extreme wealth and taxing multinational corporations, which are so obvious that, if somebody came down from Mars, they would say, my God, these humans are crazy. Why are they not doing such obvious things? The point really is that you cannot think of significant volumes of resources available for global public investment without recognizing the need to also garner those resources from those who can afford to pay. There's a real danger that the attempt will be to either shift to regressive taxation or simply say, no, we can't do this. And of course, the idea that you can't simply increase the spending of states without generating the resources over time, I believe it's flawed if you're not a holder of a global reserve currency, which most of us countries are not. And so as long as you're lower down in the currency ladder, you cannot afford to actually run large deficits over time because markets punish you. And it's important, therefore, to actually be raising those resources in very obvious, evident ways that would simultaneously at least begin to put a little pinprick in this massive, massive explosion of inequality that we have. Okay, I'd stop here. Thanks.
Jayati, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. You're raising some very important questions on how do we increase revenue for public finance as well. I'm very aware that we've got about 2 minutes of Mariana. She's been responding to some questions, but I just want to bring her in because I know she does want to comment also on some of the points that Jayati just made. So Mariana, over to you to have your departing comments before we lose you.
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much. And Jayati, it's not only great to follow you, but I started thinking that we should do like Car Talk. Have you ever heard that wonderful Car Talk radio show? We could do have people call in. We can make fun of them and give them solutions as Car Talk do. Anyway, so Jayati just raised such important points. I actually, just before she started speaking, put some numbers in the chat just to remind us there is no lack of finance. There is plenty of finance, and the trillions being made right now globally, forget the billions, the trillions being made are in the short-term financial markets, literally at the millisecond level. That is not hard to regulate. We have chosen, as you said, humanity, the Martians looking down saying, duh, to not regulate. So derivative markets exceed 600 trillion, over 25 times global GDP. And, I've been writing this for a long time now. Companies, it's not just the financial markets that are financialized, companies are financialized. So people like Bill Lazonick, myself and others have been documenting just the level of share buybacks that are in the economy, which, by the way, the physiocrats back in the 1700s, they looked at that. They looked at whether money in the system was getting reinvested back in. And in their days, it was about agriculture. And they looked at the landlords, as Jayati rightly said, rents. They looked at the landlords as the sterile class. They had these biological metaphors, not the kind of Newtonian physics metaphors that traditional economics uses. They looked at them as a sterile class because they saw that they weren't reinvesting the money back in. So they were worried about the reproduction of the system because the money was just getting siphoned off for dressing nicely at parties, fighting wars, or whatever, drinking and, nowadays prostitution and golf. I don't know. So that level of share buybacks is over 7 trillion over the last 10 years. It's really interesting how the number 7 trillion comes up a lot. So there's 7 trillion in the last 10 years of share buybacks. There's a 7 trillion SDG gap. There's 7 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies. There's a lot of trillions out there. There's 600 billion. And I think this is very conservative, by the way, figure 600 billion lost to tax avoidance and evasion. I think it's conservative because just Apple saved 3 billion just from moving their headquarters in the US. So this is US tax evasion from Cupertino, California to Reno, Nevada. That's just in California, let alone their global tax scheme. So the 600 billion is the minimal that's being lost right now a year to tax avoidance and evasion. And there's 2.6 trillion in tax expenditures being used by emerging market funds, often with no clarity at all in terms of their economic impact. So we could go on, but it just means let's stop talking about finance in terms of quantity. Let's start looking at the quality we need, driven by public purpose and public value, and also make sure that all this other finance that's getting wasted is reformed, right? I mean, whether it's financial transaction taxes, but also nationally capital gains taxes, that's where the money's being made. We talk a lot about corporate income tax. Most of the money that is being made gets charged capital gains because of how managers are paid through stock options. And that's also, by the way, why we have stock buybacks that boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And in most countries, capital gains is incredibly regressive. Believe it or not, it was the Labour Party, not the Tories, in the UK that reduced the time that private equity had to be invested from 10 years to 2 years to get a capital gains tax reduction in the name of innovation, in the name of the knowledge economy. We want to attract, venture capital and so on. Venture capital is part of the problem. They want to exit in 3 years through an IPO or a buyout. They have screwed up so many different industries. The biotech industry was massively hurt by this short-term exit-driven capital. And we haven't learned the lessons. That's what we're doing in space today with short-term VC money, not long-term directed, mission-oriented public money, working with the private sector. It's always with the private sector, but well. And that's why, again, these principles, I put in the chat, by the way, an article on the common good where I have a common good dashboard, which Jonathan resonates so well with your paper. So it's great to see all these faces around the table, because I think all of our work is like, fixing pieces of the puzzle, but then we have to come up with very concrete solutions, as Jayati has done, in terms of taxes, but also differentiating profits from rents. They are not the same thing. And during the period of inflation that we just experienced, that was rents. And unless you actually tax the excess profits in the energy sector, the food sector, and we just increase interest rates and, cause the problem to get worse, then we're not really tackling the core problem. But that needs an analytical framework that even knows what the difference is between profits and rents. And I hate to say it, modern day economics has abandoned that concept, and we need a new theory. Sorry, now I'm going into a Marxist lecture, but a new theory of value to underpin all this. And it's not Marxism, it's actually capitalism 101. How do we share risks and rewards? How do we do it? That's directed. That's how we got to the moon. It's going to be impossible to solve the problems we have around climate, around biodiversity loss, if we don't have purpose-driven investment working well with the private sector. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mariana, thank you so much. There's so much in those remarks that you've just captured there. But I think it really neatly moves us on to our 2 other discussants, which is really about the role of collective action, global institutions, how these issues are not issues that countries alone can legislate for and also solve as well. There does need to be much more collective visioning, collective approach, and also much more of a global alignment around actually how do we tackle taxation? How do we overcome some of the challenges that we're seeing with regards to the way that funding is spent as well? So with that, I'm going to come to our third discussant, Josephilda. Josephilda is the Deputy Director General of the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation of the South African government. As you all know, South Africa is the chair of the G20 and she is the chair of the G20 Development Working Group, and they are going to be hosting the G20 at the end of this year. So these are all questions I know that are at the top of South Africa as a country's agenda. And so, Josephilda, I wanted to hear from you as the host of the G20 in 2025, where you see some of these key priorities are from a global perspective, where we should be seeing much greater collective action around issues such as taxation, around public finance. But I also wanted to hear a little bit more also about global public investment as well from South Africa's perspective. We've been delighted by the supportive comments we've had from yourself and colleagues on global public investment. There's clearly something that's resonating about this idea with the South African government at the moment. How do you think development finance needs to evolve into the future for it to become much more inclusive, equitable, and fair as well, so that just fairness is a critical part of it? Josephilda, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, good day, colleagues and people who've joined from all over the world. For South Africa, this is literally a no-brainer. As chairs of the Development Working Group and as chairs of as president of the G20 as a whole, we saw that the way we are approaching these challenges that have cross-border impact is no longer the way it should. We are not doing what we should do. We're doing things the way we did them 50, 70, 100 years ago when things were very, very different. Actually, the United Nations itself says that the way we are doing things now is the way the provision of public goods was done in the Middle Ages, and we know a lot has changed. So what we then decided to do as South Africa is to bring this to the fore because of the various points that have been brought already this morning. There's this jurisdictional gap between the levels at which policy making should occur at a global level and where the action should happen at a national level. So that needs to be sorted out, a participatory gap. We know that the people who sit at the table definitely and have voice, very little of the poor, very little of the global South. And then there is an incentive and financing gap arising from the limited and weak nature of instruments to ensure that the agreements reached are actually and fully implemented to ensure the optimal provision of these global goods. That's the first a big challenge that we think by bringing this to the fore as the Development Working Group of the G20, it will deal with those challenges we mentioned. The second one is that the G20 itself, even though it does not have an enforcing mechanism, it's quite agile and relatively effective. Colleagues before have raised the actions of the BEPS, as well as the fact that let's take how the G20 reacted to the advent of COVID. A research and evaluation done by the UNDP and the OECD shows that literally the G20 was very instrumental in pursuing a transformative recovery from the G20 pandemic by one, agreeing on concrete actions for global health and vaccination, by bolstering a global economic recovery from the 2020 to 2021 recession that was brought by the advent of COVID, through a variety of measures, for example, debt relief, redistribution, MDBs, reform, sustainable finance, etc. And also by facilitating trade, by intervening against supply chains and disruptions. So we know that the G20, though not an enforcer and doesn't have enforcing mechanisms, it is able, because of its agility, to influence and drive a transformation. And then lastly, this approach that we are discussing now is literally hand in glove with South Africa's theme of the G20, which is solidarity, sustainability, and equality. Sustainability not only in terms of earth, planet, and people, peace, prosperity, but over and over generations as well. So we know that the interconnectedness of the world requires a different approach if we are to build global resilience and response. So as said earlier by all the colleagues who've spoken before me, it redefines the ambitions of global cooperation by focusing not only on poverty eradication, but also promoting sustainability, reducing inequality, and achieving global convergence in living standards. In order to illustrate why global cooperation of a different kind is extremely important, maybe we can utilize the one example where the G20 declared something as a global public good, and that was COVID-19 vaccines. We will remember here that my President Ramaphosa, during that time and negotiations of enable equitable access to vaccine, said there is a vaccine apartheid, and because of that, there was significant backsliding in critical areas of health, child immunization, cancer care, and so on, and including a resulting inflation that reached 8.7% in 2022. So this backsliding that we saw, because we were not able to respond as quickly as we should to a global challenge and respond the way we should have, made the reaching of the 2030 SDG goals even harder. And yet it was just 5 years before 2030. And we must remember that in 2015, the heads of state had already said that we resolve that between now and 2030, we will end poverty and hunger everywhere. We will combat inequalities within and among countries. We will build peaceful, just, and inclusive society to protect human rights and to promote gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of planet and natural resources. So 2015, global leaders make that promise. And then in 2020, 5 years later, all this falls apart because we had not prepared, we had not thought anew in face of the different challenges that are brought about by our interconnectedness. So this different approach that is being advocated for here will enable resilience, proactiveness, because a foundation of some sort has already been built. And we had Jonathan talk of this foundation of what was discussed during the war. And somewhat things began to fall apart. This is not about charity. We've moved beyond charity, but we must now talk of collective action to address collective global problems. It's about mutuality. It is about voice. And the interconnectedness means that unless things are done differently. It is the performance of the weakest link rather than the performance of the most capable member that will determine the welfare of the whole. We can talk about herd immunity as an example of how we must ensure that the weakest of us all as a global family rises so that we all have a better life, and we are resilient against risk, against shocks, and we minimize the threats to global stability. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Josephilda. There's, again, great concepts in there. I particularly like the collective actions for collective global challenges. It resonates with what Mariana was saying around common goods as well. So really bringing in the concept of solidarity that we have as a global citizens, as global people. We have challenges that are legitimately faced by all of us. These are not always new challenges, but they are important challenges, and unless we tackle them collectively, we will not be able to overcome them. So some fantastic elements of your talk there that were really resonant of what we're trying to bring out through global public investment. And it's great to hear that global public investment as a concept resonates so strongly with the agenda of South Africa as the G20 chair as well. And I'm definitely looking forward to working with you as you go forward. Now, I'm going to bring in our last discussant before we open up the floor for questions. Hopefully, we should have a good 10 to 20 minutes to be able to have questions from everyone. There are quite a few questions in the chat. We will try to collate them and put them to our panel after we've heard from Board Vegar. So, Board, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for being able to join us. I know it's afternoon where you are. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, and you're the Director General of the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, for anybody who doesn't know who you are. And you're also one of the co-chairs at the moment of the Financing for Development process that is underway. I'm in New York myself here for the PrepCom of the Financing for Development, the fourth Financing for Development Summit. And it'd be great today to hear from you to hear a little bit more from yourself about the process of the Financing for Development Summit. How do we bring in global public investment as an overarching vision and new framework around how we tackle global cooperation and global challenges in the future? So there's an element of how can we be really focusing our efforts as civil society, as academics, as think tank leaders, as policy wonks, the various different people we've got on this call today. What advice can you give us on how we engage with the FFD? But also, I would love to hear from you a little bit more about the fact that we're in a little bit of a difficult moment at the moment for donor countries, and the landscape for traditional northern donor countries is changing very fast at the domestic level, but also at the regional level as well. And the alliances we've seen of the past and commitment to things like ODA are fast shifting. So I would love to hear from you about what's the future for traditional donor countries. How do they need to adjust and develop to ensure that they are able to meet the challenges of the future? And what advice can you give us with regards to how we position global public investment within that landscape and those conversations as well? So, Board, lovely to have you with us. I'm going to pass over to you, and hopefully you can hear me.
I hear you well. Hope you can hear me too. Great to see you, Harpinder, and a big salute to the GPI team for all they've been achieving the last few years, and especially to Jonathan Glennie. Very few people have written one piece called "The Trouble with Aid" and another called "The Future of Aid," which is at the essence of this discussion. So it's true that the financing landscape is extremely difficult now. It's not really difficult for donor countries; it's for recipients. And the slashing of USAID, quite big cuts in many European countries' development assistance. This comes on top of higher debt burdens for many countries, but also on top of a more risk-averse situation for private investments. So capital flows, whether public or private, from rich countries to developing countries, especially the least developed, are being cut now. And what our team in NORAD also sees is that humanitarian is, of course, being not being cut that much, but development efforts to many of the poorest places in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East are quite hardly hit now in the cuts. So it's a challenging situation. I think, however, that, I mean, this is not good, but something better might come out of it. And I think it brings to the attention of many of us the need to have a much more a much broader discussion on the future of aid. And one thing which is at the essence of this future is for donors not to look at ourselves as donors, but investors, right? A lot of what we are spending abroad is investing in global public goods, in things that are good for ourselves, but also for many others. Climate mitigation, pandemic preparedness, financial stability, security, our common oceans, we could go on. These things are now part of aid budgets of many countries. And I think we remain in a paradigm where we call it aid, but in reality, these things should be thought of as investments. And I think this, what happens now, challenges us also to think about the architecture, the paradigm itself. It challenges traditional donor countries like Norway and others, but it, of course, also challenges many middle-income countries. Right? Development assistance grew out of a situation where you had a few rich countries and a lot of very poor countries. The world today is extremely different from what we saw. And it's also a challenge that more countries globally need to take more responsibility for many of these global common goals and challenges. And increasingly, such a situation where responsibility is shared, of course, according to ability and so on, would also bring a more equal relationship between donors or providers and recipients. Because if you've been working with aid for some time, you know that one of the inherent challenges of aid is that the relationship between donors and recipient has a power relation built into it. You can do a lot with it, you can work with it, we can call each other partners, but it's there. So what I hope to see in Seville and beyond Seville, and maybe especially in the years to come after the end of the FFD process so far in Seville in Spain, is a broadening of the discussion. Yes, we do need development assistance for humanitarian and for adaptation and food security and health and education and so on in the poorest countries. Yes, we do need domestic capital mobilization that will be at the heart of things, but we also need to think more clearly and better about these global public investments that needs to be done, and that's why we from Norway's side also have been interested in being part of these discussions. I think the direction we're talking about here in this panel and others is correct, even though we don't know exactly how it's going to play out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Board, you've captured the essence of GPI very succinctly, and I think for us one of the big challenges is here that we will still need development cooperation. Domestic resource mobilization needs to be really critical. It needs to be there. Humanitarian assistance is very important. But there is this wider, broad arching global challenges that need to be tackled. And the inclusive nature, the equal nature of decision making is going to be really critical there. One of the things we come up against a lot when we're having meetings on global public investment is, how do you shift that power that is so entrenched in some of the international institutions at the moment? Decision making is sitting very firmly in the hands of a few. And the issues that they're talking about and addressing now are no longer the domain of the few decision makers. And I wonder if I can, on the basis that you've just finished speaking, if I can ask you a question around, which is popping into my mind over and over again, is how do we create the political momentum to actually shift the way decision making has been happening at global institutions, to become more inclusive, to open up that table of decision makers to be beyond the sort of the 5, the 10, the 28 donors, whatever that might be, to be a much more of a broader coalition, where we might, as a group of actors, be able to actually push some of this in the near future through our own campaigning and advocacy. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So, of course, if I knew the answer, but let me reflect on two sides of that, which I, of course, thought a lot about and worked quite a lot with also. And I think the first part of that answer is really important, is that developed countries, OECD countries that do aid and stuff, so we continue to think about aid as something we're giving away, right? I often get the question, why should we spend taxpayers' money abroad? So I think as long as it's framed as aid and people think of it as something we give to other countries only for them, the willingness to do more, to change the power relation will not be there. The thinking has to be, it's part of solving our own problems, where it's more effective to solve it, at least partly through international investments, right? If we want to prepare ourselves for climate change in Europe, right? Parts of the investment, which is smart and effective, is to invest a lot in mitigation in middle-income countries around the world. And you could go on having the same reasoning for pandemic preparedness, or for equality globally and things like that. It's a different framing where the question changes. It goes to, where is it most effective to invest, and what combination of investments in Norway and investments internationally is better. And then you inherently also just change the way you see the power relation. You're not giving, you're investing. And let me just briefly add also that the scarcity of resources right now in for international issues, I think kind of creates a bit of conservatism. Many people, many countries become skeptical. Change, you hang on to what you have. I see also many NGOs and international agencies do that. Well, I think it's a situation where we have to challenge each other and think differently about the narrative instead.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much. Let me see if I can open this up to bring some of the other speakers in. We've got a number of questions coming in. I'm trying to synthesize them because I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. One of the questions that is there for all of the speakers, really, but maybe I can go to Jayati first on it. It's a question around the fact that we need to challenge the very goal of the global economic system, the infinite growth mentality, as opposed to putting planetary and human well-being at the center. So Jayati, I wonder if you could be the first to come in on that, and if others just want to put up their hands on the panel, whoever would like to come in on that, that would be great.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. And I was very much wanting to come in on that. So thank you for raising that. So absolutely, I completely agree with Jess Blankers, I think, who raised the question, because the problem really is that we are constantly looking at the economy the wrong way around. We're looking at everything in terms of how that delivers for the economy. We want more health for everybody because it gives you a more productive economy. We want more women in the workforce because that adds to GDP. That's nonsensical. We really have to think of the economy in service of people, society, the planet, which really means you say, okay, these are our goals. We want, let's say, health for all, capabilities, an ability to deal with our ecological constraints and the planetary kinds of challenges. We want we want a reduction of inequality. We want all of these things. What is the economy that will give us that? And I think GPI is very much integrated into that vision. The GPI vision is not one that is saying we necessarily have to think about it in terms of how it delivers GDP. We all know that GDP is a terrible measure. Again, I don't think I have to tell this crowd that GDP is a terrible measure. So that's why I actually get very frustrated with the fights between the degrowthers and the green growthers, because frankly, to me, that's the wrong question. If we think it's a terrible measure, why do we care whether it goes up or down? In fulfilling the other goals, maybe it goes up, maybe it goes down, maybe it stays the same. That's not the point. The point is, does it increase good quality employment? Does it provide basic needs for all the people? Does it provide essential services in an affordable, good quality manner? Does it manage the planetary constraints? And is it within the boundaries? And are we oppressing nature too much? It has to actually look at those issues. And we look at the economy in terms of not just revenue raising, fiscal policy, but also regulation in terms of how it delivers on all of these. And if we do that, then, the principle of GPI is really one where you're not saying, oh, we have to have the we have to have more growth because that's how we will get the money from which we can generate all of the investments we need. No, we are saying that these are our goals. Let's think of that combination of public investment, regulation, directing and shaping the markets, as Mariana says, that will deliver our particular goals. And that's really the way we need to start looking at the economy. And that's a very important mindset for all of our policymakers to change. But I want to also, if I may, just quickly react to something Bard said, which I think is so important, the power relation between donors and recipients, and the fact that too many donor countries, it's not just governments, but people, still think of it as a kind of gift. That, we're being nice to the poor, we're being good to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, these mindsets don't just change because they're wrong. We know that people, and unfortunately, that mindset hasn't changed. I mean, we've seen Europe doing a real Me Too with the US. Yeah, the US cuts down aid. Switzerland cuts down aid. The UK cuts down aid. I mean, it's appalling, right? What I find incredible here is also the absence of any kind of strategic thinking of these governments. I mean, WHO is a global public good, right? They are short $1 billion a year because the US pulled out. Seriously, the EU cannot provide $1 billion? India cannot provide $1 billion? I mean, what's going on? That no country says, okay, we step up and we provide it because we are all gainers from this major global public good, which is the WHO. So I think, this is the biggest stumbling block. Let me put it frankly, they're just the sheer stupidity of our leaders who are unable to see this basic fact. So how do we confront this? And I go back to, I have to leave some, so forgive me if I keep talking, but the reason I'm saying that we have to confront this, recognizing that this is stupidity, one way of doing it is what Joe Stiglitz has been talking about in his meeting. Think of a G-1, basically. Go ahead without the US and things would get better. I mean, I personally think the best thing that could happen to the IMF and the World Bank is for the US to leave. Unfortunately, they won't, because they have the veto power and they're going to stick to it and they're going to keep destroying that already. But we have to develop coalitions of the willing. And we already have some. We have some promising leaders and governments that are willing to take this up in South Africa, in Brazil, in Spain, in Colombia, in some other countries. We can actually rely on coalitions of the willing to move forward with some of these things, which would actually make citizens in other countries say, well, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we, for example, joining on tax? Why aren't we recognizing that forgiving some of this debt is in our own interests to enhance the trade between our two economies for the debtor country and the creditor country, etc.? There are many ways in which we can use coalitions of the willing if we are creative about it. And, I personally, let me just say, financing for development, I think it's a huge opportunity, not necessarily because we're going to get a wonderful outcome document. Because we got a really good outcome document 20 years ago, it didn't do anything. I think it's a huge opportunity to create these coalitions, which means we have to start working on them now. And so really all the lead up to FFD is to get these coalitions moving and doing things that actually inspire other countries to follow suit.
Jayati, you've covered a couple of the questions that I was going to ask anyway. One was going to be around political strategies around engagement. The FFD's got this new concept of a action platform, which is all going to be about various different governments coming together to make commitments. So it's not just about the outcome document, it's also about making commitments that then can be actionable and actually leads to something. So there's a real opportunity there for coalitions of the willings to coalesce around key big ideas and not be only worried about the outcome document as well. I'm really worried about time. Jonathan, I want to give you 5 minutes to do a bit of a summary and a response to what you've heard from the different discussants. But before I do that, can I come to Josephilda and to board just to give me your last 1 minute thoughts on anything you've heard today or any advice you would give our wonderful audience who have been listening very intently to this discussion? Josephilda.
I can start and I'll be very quick. There is a proposal here on the chart for a framework of some sort to be developed, and we cannot agree more. As the development working group, we are attempting to come up with principles towards this rebuilding for a more inclusive provision and more equitable as well as optimal provision of global public goods. And one of the principles of that a framework that we are trying to come up with as the development working group includes promoting, for example, the role of innovation and technology in addressing GPG provision, leveraging new economic models, which we've all spoken about here, ensuring diversified and predictable funding, ensuring that we take from those, we all contribute, taking from those that have to those that need, etc., etc. So we are coming up with these principles, and we're hoping to sell them to the rest of the G20 and eventually to the rest of the globe. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Josephilda. And if there's anything we can do to support the framework, please do let us know. I know we will all be very happy to be able to put our weight around that for you as well. Board, just over to you for your last thoughts before I hand over to Jonathan.
So maybe just 2 quick points. So I saw someone in chat ask me if there's a political momentum or an opportunity to do some of these changes. Well, I was in a roundtable at the annual meetings of the World Bank where someone said, there were discussions about these things, and someone said, well, there's no burning platform now. The politicians aren't interested. Maybe we have our burning platform, actually, with what's happening now. I think, one way forward is, a withdrawal from the US from international cooperation. Sometimes you can wonder, is this a diplomatic gift to China or what they're thinking? But the other alternative is re-engagement. I mean, use this momentum to actually raise different ways of working together. And the second point, just to go back to what Jayati said, we have to go from gift to investment. I completely agree. And that will challenge something from, rich countries, Europe, US, Japan. It's a different way to think, right? It's not gifts, it's investment. But it will also challenge China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa to be a bigger part of common financing in the future. So it's really hard work. It will take a lot of time, but then we better get to it, because it's needed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Absolutely. It's a long journey, but I think we've been on it for a while, and we're all here for the reason that we believe in the importance of this journey as well. Jonathan, can I give you 5 minutes to do your reflections on what you've heard today and what that means from where you're sitting with regards to global public investment as well? And then I will spend 2 minutes just outlining a slide of what's coming next so that our audience can go away armed with some dates as well. So Jonathan.
Thanks, Pin, and thanks to all the speakers, and really also to all the people putting comments and questions. I think it's been such a brilliant discussion, really inspiring. I've been working on this for a long time, so it takes something to kind of re-inspire me and also kind of really give me new ideas and thinking. And I think that what's exciting, I think, Pin, is that from our network, we are seeding and inspiring ways of thinking, but like actually technical responses, but also a kind of political response to the current moment. I was struck by a comment. I was in a meeting the other day in Washington, and a climate person, somebody working on climate for a long time, said, you know, we've always said that the tragic thing about our work is, and sorry about this, but about humanity, is that we kind of need a terrible crisis to get the transformational change we need. And as we all know, the last time that we had mega change and mega systemic reform at international level was coming out of the horrific crisis of the Second World War. And the question was, is humanity so dumb that it's going to take something like that again to get us to make the decisions we need to make on climate and other stuff? And it got me thinking that maybe I don't know if this is going to sound right, but maybe we got lucky, and the turmoil we're facing at the moment, and the chaos we're facing at the moment, is a relatively little crisis that will give us the opportunity to make the transformations we need. In other words, yes, it's a crisis, but it's not an overwhelming one, and it's an opportunity for us to go on and make the systemic changes we need to make, that we've always known we needed to make for some time, but we wouldn't have made if things had gone on as business as usual. Clearly, this is not business as usual. I agree with Jayati and others who've said that FFD is an opportunity, not so much for the necessarily the negotiated text, let's see how that goes, but for the momentum we can build behind coalitions and behind a new narrative. And here I just want to add my voice, and it's what the paper says, but, you know, Board expressed it so clearly, Jayati expressed it so clearly, and others have, you know, this word investment and this language, and moving away from this language of charity. And the UK Foreign Secretary, and I'm not personalizing it on him, a lot of people have come to this language. When he said, when he went to Parliament and explained why they were cutting UK ODA almost by half, he said, we're not ideologues, we're pragmatists, and we had to choose, and this is a quote, between the compassion of internationalism and our hard-nosed reality of national security. And I just think that is a demonstration that we as a sector have failed, because we have allowed politicians to associate the important investment in our global challenges that we all need to make, and I think the speakers have expressed this so well. We've allowed politicians to associate that with charity and compassion, something that if we haven't got the money for, we put it to the back of our budget, we can't do it, it's in the wrong time. That is the wrong framing for the opportunities and risks that our world currently faces. We have to frame this better, and it's not good enough to have it in brackets in the 5th paragraph of a statement. It has to be the first paragraph now. We have to put that front and center, and it won't happen immediately. We've spent years and possibly decades allowing the kind of charity and compassion narrative to dominate in the global north. It's never dominated in the global south. And I think, you know, everyone around the world is kind of ready for this new narrative, which doesn't, by the way, reduce our emphasis on generosity and kindness and solidarity and all that stuff. But it makes a really hard-nosed case for the importance of this investment. And that was, you know, like I said, it's kind of half the report. And then the other half was about mutuality and the rise of the South in institutions. And I think there's a huge opportunity, and I hope we take it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate that. There's a lot of optimism here at this discussion and lots of different ideas. With that, I just want to put up one slide. At the beginning of this session, I mentioned the campaign for global public investment that we're going to be launching in a few weeks. I wonder if we can get the slide up. We've got quite a few different things coming up, and I wanted to make sure that this audience was aware. First of all, for those of you who are in New York at the moment for the Financing for Development discussions and other meetings, we will be holding a strategy session tomorrow. It's going to be a strategy session followed by a short social as well, for us to be able to have a drink and have a chat about these issues in a more informal way. But it's really important that we bring our members and our partners together to start to think about actually how do we create that path that we've been talking about today. And a lot of the questions have been asking this question as well, is what does the communications look like? What does the narrative look like? What comes next? So if you are in New York, that meeting will happen between 3:30 and 5:30 p.m. tomorrow on 23rd Street near 6th Avenue. Please be there. We will also put that on the WhatsApp group as well, and so that you've got that information. Secondly, we are having a members meeting on the 13th of May, where we'll be talking about the campaign for 2025, the campaign for GPI, and making sure that our members have the ability to discuss it and really brainstorm around what they can be doing to help support and deliver the campaign, and how we can be supporting them with the materials, the talking points, and the documents that will be useful for them too, so that they can engage with their country governments and in the various different processes that they are part of. And then we will be doing a formal public launch of the campaign on May the 29th as well. And we will be having something happening pretty much every month. We're looking at side events at Seville. So a lot more to come, but these are the 3 more urgent dates in the next 4 weeks that I wanted to make sure you had. Please do look out for more information as it comes up. But more than anything, I'm personally very, very keen to hear your ideas, your comments, your thoughts on actually how do we as a collective take this forward. There are opportunities. Yes, there are hurdles in the road, but there are many opportunities, and we want to be able to seize these opportunities with both hands and go forth. And what resonates for me is the collective action, the importance of collective action around the collective global challenges we face. So if we could be coming together, please do let me know what we should be doing. Any thoughts and advice, I'm always open for it. My team, who have been wonderful at steering us at Global Public Investment for a number of years, are very keen to get your thoughts. So please do send them through. We're really looking forward to hearing more from you and continue to take this forward. Thank you to our great speakers today and to Jonathan for his report. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope we can take it offline as well and continue it in a little bit more of an informal fashion, because I think we scratched the surface of some very important concepts and approaches today. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day wherever you may be around the world, and thank you so much to our speakers. Bye-bye.